Thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly, for that incredible introduction. Hello, HRC! It is so great to be back with family. As I stand here looking out at so many familiar faces, I am filled with gratitude. Today, I have the privilege of both living authentically as a queer transgender woman and serving as a state senator in the district that I was born and raised in. Something that would have seemed so impossible to me as a kid that it was almost incomprehensible. And there is no organization, there is no group of people more responsible for that change than HRC. This is an organization that made my service and the growing chorus of LGBTQ elected officials even possible. But even more than that, this is the place with my HRC family where I found my hope. Working with and eventually for HRC, I witnessed change that I never believed was possible. The work of this organization solved the crisis of hope that I, like so many young LGBTQ people, faced when I felt alone and I worried that the heart of this country was simply not big enough to love someone like me. And right now, I don't take that hope that I found here at HRC for granted. Because at this moment, across this country, anti-equality politicians are trying to rip that hope away from us. They're attempting to undo our progress. They're engaging in a mean and malicious effort to bully some of the most amazing and badass but vulnerable members of our community, transgender youth. They're trying to rip trans kids away from parents and providers, coaches and classmates, teammates and teachers, friends and family members, stripping away any layer of support these kids may have, leaving them isolated, telling these kids that they are unworthy of love and support, that they don't belong in our country. But they do belong. We belong. We belong and we exist everywhere. And that presence, the power of our proximity, that is the superpower of our movement. In living our lives openly and authentically, we are organic agents of change. We see how our presence in workplaces improves company policies. We see how a child coming out can transform a family's love. And we see that when we have a seat at the table in government, policies and priorities and conversations can change. It's easy to score political points on the backs of a community when you don't have to look us in the eye, when you don't have to answer our questions, when you don't have to deal with our votes. Even in the worst of cases, our presence as out LGBTQ people in government makes the jobs of anti-equality forces harder and more uncomfortable. We expose the cruelty of their policies. And as was the case with Zoe Zephyr in Montana, show the hollowness of their feigned commitment to free speech. Our kindness contrasts with their pettiness. And our mere presence in these spaces serves as an undeniable and unavoidable reminder of the humanity of our cause. But even more importantly, through our presence and our perseverance, we maintain the bonds that, over time, admittedly all too slowly, the bonds that can open even the most closed hearts and minds. 4 months ago, I had a deeply moving experience on the floor of the Delaware State Senate that reminded me of the importance of our presence. It was the final week of our legislative session. Just 2 days earlier, I had made an electoral announcement that for federal tax purposes I can't explicitly state right now at this event. It was an announcement that got a lot of attention. But unsurprisingly, it was also an announcement that was met with what is all too common when an LGBTQ person strives to do something that has never been done before. I faced hate, vitriol, and threats. And because of those threats, our state capitol had to increase security, a fact that both my Democratic and Republican colleagues were aware of. And so coincidentally, 2 days later, with increased security visible, I brought forward legislation that I was sponsoring banning the LGBTQ panic defense in Delaware, a legal defense that essentially claims, as many of you know, that anti-LGBTQ violence is excusable. The bill had passed the state house on fairly partisan lines a few weeks before. And 2 days after that announcement, I brought the bill to the Senate floor. I presented on it, gave my opening remarks, and prepared to do what all of us in this room have gotten far too used to doing: defend my dignity and humanity. I finished my remarks, I paused, and I waited for my Republican colleagues to oppose the bill. I waited for them to say at best that this was a solution in search of a problem, or at worst, to allude to reasons why violence might be understandable, if not justified. And so I braced myself as my Republican colleagues stood up to speak. But then something happened. Each one of them stood up with the knowledge of the increased security in the building, looked me directly in the eyes, and with tears swelling in their eyes, they validated the pain and fear that many LGBTQ people live with. They affirmed the dignity of LGBTQ lives. And to a person, they not only declared that they would be voting for the bill, but led by the most conservative member of that caucus, for the first time ever, each one of them stood and asked to be added as a co-sponsor of the legislation. And look, I'm not here to give my Republican colleagues a pass. It's a pretty low bar here. I know that making clear that there's no excuse for violence is quite literally the bare minimum. But what happened in that moment was more profound than the single policy that was before us. Because what happened in that moment, due to the swirl of circumstance, was that these Republican politicians began to understand that the political was fundamentally personal. That this wasn't an abstract issue, but something that impacted someone they knew personally, and yes, someone that they cared about. And while that moment of breakthrough won't change their minds on every issue of LGBTQ equality overnight, while they won't be leading the Pride Parade tomorrow, you can't undo that synaptic connection once it happens. And it's in moments like those, often so small to be almost invisible, that so much of our progress as a movement is built on. And in this critical hour, the greatest threat to our community, our movement, and our country is not that we underestimate the scale of the challenges ahead of us. The biggest risk is that we fail to summon the hope necessary to see this fight through. Right now, it's considered in vogue to be cynical. It's considered naive to be hopeful. And I get it. It can be easy to feel hopeless. Despite how far we've come, this moment feels different than before. When 10 or 15 years ago, it felt like if we simply worked for it, change was inevitable. It's hard to feel confident that if we do what we need to do, that everything will work out. And for the first time in a long time, we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But the truth is, that sense of inevitability that we may have felt, that is the exception in our nation's history. Every previous generation of Americans has been called upon to conquer seemingly insurmountable odds even greater than the ones that we face today. Enslaved people in the 1850s who had no reason to believe that an Emancipation Proclamation was on the horizon. Children risking life and limb in the factories in the 1890s who had every reason to think that things wouldn't get better. Unemployed workers standing in bread lines during the early days of the Great Depression who had never heard of a New Deal. Civil rights marchers facing brutality as they set off from Selma who didn't know whether the Voting Rights Act would pass. Patrons at the Stonewall Inn who fought back against government oppression and never knew of an America where we could gather as we are tonight without violating the law. All of these Americans had every reason to fear that change would never come. They couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but they persevered. They summoned their hope, they found the light, and they changed the world. And if they've done it before, then we can do it again. Because so long as we exist, we educate. So long as we are present, we progress. And as the saying goes, so long as we breathe, we hope. Which is why standing here tonight before my HRC family, I am as confident as I have ever been that we have what it takes to ensure that the story of this moment is not the story of bigotry or backlash, but of pride and of progress. That it will be the story of us coming out, conquering our crisis of hope, finding that light, and building a world where an LGBTQ young person, including trans kids, can grow up and know that they belong. They belong in our communities, they belong in our schools, they belong in our workplaces, and yes, they even belong in the halls of Congress. Thank you all very much. It's an honor to be with you tonight, and it's a privilege to be with you in this fight.